Ah, my friend, prepare your heart for a journey not through distant lands, but through the deepest corners of a man's soul, a man who lived in the shadows, but whose presence was a foundation of everything. Forget the grand speeches, the glorious battles, the names shouted in palaces. This is a story of divine whisper, of a fidelity that became silence, and of a love that changed the course of the winds. Let's together uncover what the world's eyes forgot, but heaven's heart never did. It was a time when thrones rose with the vanity of kings, and altars fumed with a thirst for power of priests. Amidst this noise, a man lived in a silence more eloquent than any shout. He wielded no swords, commanded no armies, nor displayed himself in public squares. His strength came not from steel, but from wood. And yet he held in his arms a promise that would one day free the world. While crowds chased miracles and wonders, he dedicated himself to nails, to planks, to a piece of wood that took shape under his calloused hands. He cared for a boy who, unknowingly, would rewrite time. History celebrated emperors with their laurel crowns and prophets with their thundering voices, but he chose the opposite path, to fade so that another might shine, to diminish himself so that the light of truth could ignite the world. His name? Joseph. For many, merely the husband of the girl who gave birth to the Messiah. For some, the carpenter of Nazareth. But behind this common name, behind the workshop's dust, hides a profound mystery, an invisible web of providence. Because without Joseph, the greater plan, the breath of redemption, might have been interrupted before it even blossomed. Who was this man, then, chosen by the divinity itself to be a father, a protector for his most precious son? Why did the ancient scriptures, which detail every great deed, silence him after a certain point, even though he was a central piece of a promise as old as life itself? And what did tradition for centuries conceal about his life, his sorrows, his silent departure, and his role that, though invisible, was the pillar of everything? Why, after the child of the one who would change everything, is Joseph never mentioned again? What was the real impact of his silence on the Savior's formation? And, most astonishing of all, what did the heavenly realm see in him that the world, in its haste and distraction, simply ignored? Before we delve together into this journey that, I promise, will touch your soul and perhaps even challenge your way of seeing sacred history, I ask for a moment. If this search for hidden truths moves you, please subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. It's your way of saying you want more of these profound and transformative narratives. Now, take a deep breath. Prepare to discover the untold truth behind the extraordinary life of Joseph, the man who chose silence. Let our journey of discovery begin. The guardian of the silent promise, the plane, that simple tool, scored the wood with a soft, rhythmic sound, almost a song. Joseph repeated the motion. He didn't need to look. Every grain of a cedar, every knot, every irregularity of that living material was as familiar as the calluses on his own hands. He knew the wood as he knew himself. Sunbeams, thin as golden needles, pierced the cracks in the workshop's mud wall. They danced and suspended dust in the air, revealing a tiny world of floating particles. It was just another day in Nazareth, like so many others, like all of them, at least on the outside. But inside, deep in Joseph's soul, the universe was about to reorder itself. He was of the ancient lineage. Yes, a direct descendant of the great kings of old, of the men who had shaped the destiny of their people. At least, that's what the elders said, with a tone that mixed pride and a certain lament. The throne had crumbled, disappeared under the weight of years and invasions, but the name still carried weight. It brought no crown, no riches, only a silent responsibility, an inheritance that was more burden than privilege. Royal blood, which once wore robes of purple, now hid beneath coarse linen aprons, under the smell of sweat and sawdust, and the constant, rhythmic sound of the hammer striking wood. And that's what Joseph did. He didn't just shape planks and beams. He shaped days, gave structure to time. His workshop was modest, humble. Some tools he had inherited from his father, old but resilient pieces. Others he had improvised, adapted, created with the practical intelligence of one who knows the raw material and respects the process. There was no luxury in that place, but there was order. And there was silence, a silence Joseph had learned to hear, to value, to respect, as if it were the very voice of the Creator, while others complained, cried out for justice, for vengeance, for a change that would come from outside. He lived that justice in every timely delivery, in every exact measurement, in every client he served with unquestionable honesty. He never sought greatness in the eyes of men. He simply sought to be a man of integrity, a righteous man in everything he did. And with this spirit, this rectitude manifested in small details, he had promised to care for a young woman named Mary. She was still very young, with clear eyes that seemed to carry the purity of the fields and a soft voice that blended with the wind. She walked with calm steps, almost imperceptible, but her presence, that lingered in the air, a trace of lightness and mystery. The families had arranged a marriage commitment, as was the custom. Joseph did not object. He was not given to overwhelming passions, to those flames that consume all at once. But he felt a quiet satisfaction, a serene peace, knowing that by her side he could build a home. Perhaps, who knows, a new and worthy beginning for his family name, for the forgotten lineage, until the news arrived. First, as a poorly disguised whisper, almost a rustle of dry leaves. Then, the strange looks, laden with doubt, with veiled censure. And finally, the words, harsh as stones thrown to the ground. Mary was expecting a child, and it was not his. Joseph's hands, accustomed to the firmness of wood, trembled for the first time in many years. It was not jealousy that shook him, not that burning fury that consumes. It was something deeper, more desolate. The disappointment of a broken promise, the imminent shame, the confusion that muddled all his thoughts. He knew Mary, or he thought he knew her, and, even amidst a storm forming in his chest, his heart refused to believe she could have broken her word, stained the honor he so cherished. Then he made a decision, a painful decision, but one that came from his most righteous essence, to leave her secretly, not out of cowardice, not to flee responsibility, but out of a mercy few would be able to understand. The law, that very law he so respected, allowed public exposure, humiliation, stoning, total disgrace. But Joseph was different. He chose the most difficult path, the most solitary, to disappear, to take the blame, to remain silent, to spare her. Better to be considered a fool than to tarnish her name. That night, sleep did not come. He lay down, yes, but his eyes remained open, fixed on the dark ceiling. The small, trembling oil lamp burned beside his wooden bed. The flame shadow danced on the roof beams. His mind spun, trying to fit together the pieces of a puzzle that made no sense. Divinity seemed silenced, as always, and Joseph prepared to accept another loss, another promise that, apparently, would not be fulfilled. It was then that the light in the room seemed to change. He did not see a celestial messenger with wings and shining robes, not like in campfire stories. But he felt it. He felt a presence. Like one who awakened from a dream and realizes that, in truth, they were never sleeping. A certainty filled the room, not with terror, but with serene authority. And a voice, not a sound heard with the ears, but an understanding that settled in the soul, spoke within him. Joseph, you come from the lineage of David. Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. There was no discussion, no lengthy explanations, no unnecessary details, only the truth, delivered with a precision that cut through any doubt. The child she carried was not the fruit of a scandal, but of a miracle, and Joseph believed, not because he understood everything, not because his mind could grasp its dimension, but because he recognized the tone of divinity, the same tone that had shaped the great prophets, that had silenced arrogant kings, that had made bushes burn without being consumed in the desert, the same tone that now entrusted him with the greatest task of all, to care for the one who would one day care for the entire world. At sunrise he stood. He dressed without haste, washed his face with the water left over from the night, and walked towards Mary's house. She saw him approach, with eyes of one expecting the worst, condemnation, abandonment. But Joseph smiled, a smile that said, I know, and more than that, I am here. He asked for no proof, demanded no explanations, sought no justification. He simply took her hand, like someone guarding a treasure, like someone choosing to carry in silence the way of a plan that transcends all human understanding. From that day on, Joseph ceased to be just a carpenter, a common man among many. He became a shield, a fortress, a refuge, not only for Mary, but for the divinity itself becoming flesh. And while everyone around whispered, scoffed, looked away, Joseph remained firm, working from dawn to dusk, preparing the trousseau with scraps, building the crib with his own hands. Without trumpets, without applause, without glory, only faith, and a silence that shouted louder than any proclamation. Invitation to delve deeper. If this journey through Joseph's soul is touching you as it touches me, consider joining us by leaving your like and subscribing to the channel. Every gesture you make helps uncover more of these forgotten treasures and strengthens our community. The village that whispered and the heart that heard. The village awoke slowly. The smell of fresh bread, baked in a communal oven, spread to the narrow alleys of Nazareth, mixing with the scent of wet earth and the acrid aroma of animal dung. Women pounded grain in mortars, in an ancient rhythm, learned from their grandmothers, an echo of generations. Children ran barefoot among the gnarled olive trees, their thin laughter lost in the morning breeze. And the men, as always, walked to their trades, each to his daily task. But Joseph did not walk. He stood at the entrance of his workshop, his face still pale from the sleepless night, and looked at the horizon, like one who hears what others cannot. The celestial messenger had come, but not like in the legends told around the campfire, not in flaming light or dazzling robes that blind the eyes. The messenger had come in a dream, and yet it had been more real, more tangible than the wood itself under his hands. The voice he had heard was not made of words that dissipate in the air. It was made of truth, of a certainty that nestled deep within his being. And now Joseph had to decide. In the region of Galilee, the marriage commitment, the alliance between families, was almost sacred, unlike other cultures. For his people, the promise to unite held the weight of a formal oath. It was public, recorded, validated before the elders of the community. Joseph and Mary had not yet consummated their union, but in the eyes of the law and the people, they already belonged to each other. Breaking that alliance meant shame, scandal, irreparable rift between families, and humiliating questioning in the court of the synagogue. This was exactly what Joseph wanted to avoid when he thought of leaving her secretly. The public humiliation would be hers, her family's, a visible burden for all. But the silence, the guilt, the pain would be as a weight only men of great integrity understood. However, the dream had turned everything upside down. Do not be afraid, the celestial messenger had said. Joseph had never heard such simple words, with such force, with a power that disarmed the soul. In a world where fear was a daily companion, fear of hunger, of oppressive soldiers, of neighbors' rejection, of guilt that gnawed at the soul, that command, coming from above, was a balm that both wounded and healed. Take Mary. To receive, in the language of messengers, was more than simply to accept. It was to protect, to cover with one's own name, to take upon oneself the promise, and also the rejection, the mystery and the pain, not as a deceived fool, but as one who chooses to trust fully. Joseph's decision was not merely domestic, an issue between a man and a woman. It was something much greater. It was cosmic. Joseph knew he couldn't explain it to the neighbors, nor to the grumpy uncles, nor to the synagogue leaders. There would be no conventional rituals, perhaps not even the celebration that normally accompanied the start of a new family. Custom called for 7 days of feasting, wine, dancing, songs of joy. But with Mary pregnant and the sharp tongues of the people, everything would be different. The customs of Galilee, according to ancient accounts, valued honor above justice itself. And honor, for them, was about keeping up appearances, what others thought. But Joseph had not been trained to please men. That morning, as he put on his simple tunic, he felt a different weight, as if the fabric already carried part of his mission. He left the house unhurriedly, walked through the streets where everyone whispered. He did not avert his gaze. He did not respond to the murmurs that flew like flies around him. He walked to the house of Joachim, Mary's father, and there, in plain sight, asked to see her. Mary appeared, her eyes red-rimmed, not from shame, but from a contained anguish that suffocated her. He said nothing. He simply approached, lightly touched her shoulder, and nodded. It was done. Both knew what that meant. No explanation would be enough for the village. But there was something between them that did not depend on words, a pact older than any human promise, to endure the invisible together. In the days that followed, the stares became more intense. The elders, sitting in the square, whispered among themselves. Some said Joseph had been seduced, that he had fallen into disgrace. Others, that he was an accomplice to a blatant lie. Few dared to think, or even consider, a miracle. After all, who would believe that the Most High would communicate with a simple carpenter? But Joseph maintained a steady gaze. He returned to the workshop every day. His hands were calloused, but firm, and each piece of what he delivered seemed to carry more than just a function. It carried a secret promise, an unshakable faith. At the synagogue, the religious teachers watched him from afar. They did not expel him, but they no longer greeted him either. The woman he had taken in was now the subject of comments, and he, her accomplice. And yet, Joseph was not ashamed. In his heart, he understood that his mission was not to shine, not to be applauded. It was to sustain, not to receive honors, but to carry what was invisible, what was divine, like the foundations of a house. No one sees them, but without them, everything collapses. He would not be the prophet, nor the worker of wonders, nor even the biological father. But he would be the one who remained, who stood firm when all others retreated. Joseph was beginning to understand that the dream had not just been a warning. It was a call, and when he went back to sleep, he no longer feared the stares, because in the silence of his soul, another voice already reigned. To ensure this story reaches more hearts, if you are enjoying this journey of discovery, please take a moment to subscribe, leave your like, and share. Your support is the engine that allows us to tell even more of these hidden stories. Let's continue with the narrative, the shield of silence. Others' words came like randomly thrown stones, but none left visible marks on Joseph's skin. He walked through the streets of Nazareth with his head held high, but his shoulders carried a silent tension. He knew what they were saying. He knew how they looked at him. At every corner, a veiled judgment. In every nod of the head, an unspoken doubt. She was expecting a child, and he had not touched her. In people's eyes, there were only two possibilities, both humiliating. Either she had betrayed him, staining his honor, or he was a culprit, now pretending to be a decent man. Neither was the truth, but neither could be proven. And in Nazareth, the mere appearance of fault was enough for silent, relentless condemnation. Joseph chose silence. The law gave him the right to expose her, to take her to the elders, to present the facts and request a formal separation. Ancient texts allowed repudiation, and in extreme cases, even death by stoning. But Joseph did not seek revenge, nor the justice the people expected. He sought to protect, even if it meant carrying a shame that was not his, a pain that did not belong to him. The affection he felt for Mary was not an impetuous impulse, nor the romantic passion sung in poems. It was a love built on a firm ground of respect, on conscious choice, on assumed responsibility. A love that recognized the pain of the woman who carried not just a boy, but a mystery no one would understand. That night, the messenger returned. Not in a dream this time, but as a living memory of what had been said. The voice still echoed, engraved in the beams of his mind. Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife. Receive, assume, bear the scandal with her, and with the child, who was not his, but who would one day call him father. Joseph took a deep breath. At dawn, he went to meet Mary's father. Tradition called for a second stage of marriage, the consummation, the moment to bring her to his home, to make the union public. But nothing was like other weddings. There would be no celebration, no music, no 7 days of joy and abundance. Only the calm step of a man who chose to obey the Creator more than social norms. Mary waited, her eyes resolute, her belly already slightly rounded, unmistakable. She knew that crossing that threshold meant there was no turning back. She would be seen as impure, and he, as a fool. But when she saw him arrive, Joseph's expression was not one of fear. It was one of decision. He took her hand, under the judging gaze of neighbors and relatives, eyes that pierced the soul. They entered the simple house, with walls stained by smoke and the smell of yesterday's bread. And there, under a roof of mud and hope, the Son of the Most High had a family, at least in the eyes of the world. Joseph did not touch her. The ancient account is clear. Conjugal union did not happen until the child came to light. He respected not only the divine promise, but also the purity of that womb that carried something even he could not fully comprehend. It was a double obedience, to faith and to love. The days that followed were heavy. Joseph left early for his work, now carrying the weight of others' stares in every gesture. Clients came less often. Orders diminished. Some, upon receiving the wooden pieces he himself delivered, refused to pay, not out of malice, but out of contempt, as if to say, "We don't want to owe anything to a man like you." Joseph lowered his head, turned, and walked silently down the dusty street. Mary felt everything, but said nothing. She simply focused on the small space of the house, preparing fabrics, sharpening needles, sewing scraps. The two looked at each other more than they spoke, and with time, the silence between them ceased to be empty and became a pact, a language of their own, made of glances, of small gestures of sharing, of a quiet faith that grew every day. In the synagogue, Joseph's place was now further away, not because he had been expelled, but because he himself moved not to flee, but to avoid causing more problems, more gossip. He did not see himself as a victim, nor as a hero, but simply as a servant, a simple man, called to guard something immense. When asked, and sometimes they did ask, Joseph merely said, "The Creator knows," and that was enough for him, even if it wasn't for anyone else. One afternoon, as he adjusted the last pieces of a rudimentary crib he had built, Joseph paused. The late afternoon light entered to the mud window and touched the unfinished wood. He ran his hand over the smooth surface and thought, "He will sleep here, not his own son, but the Creator's son." And no matter how much the world saw him as a fool, he knew that there, in that house of dust and honor, the heavenly kingdom was beginning something. And he had said yes. Still with us on this journey? So that more hearts can feel this flame of revelation, please leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who values profound messages. Your support helps us expand the reach of this message. The road of promise and the breath of the impossible. The warning arrived with the seal of the empire and the weight of iron. An imperial decree, clear and non-negotiable. Everyone must register in their hometowns. No matter the age, condition, health, it was the law. And before a power like that rulers, not even the womb of a woman about to give birth was exempt. Joseph heard the decree read aloud in the synagogue, in silence. The scribe barely disguised his discomfort. No one wanted that journey. But everyone knew that disobeying the empire was like provoking a lion with bare hands. Bethlehem, that's where he had to go. The city of his ancestors. The city of the ancient king of his lineage. The same city from which the prophet had said the one who would shepherd his people would come. Joseph didn't know what hurt more, the long journey or the risk to Mary. She didn't protest. She simply listened, then looked at him with eyes that didn't ask why, but rather, when do we leave? There was, in that silent gaze, a new pact. No longer with Nazareth, but with the road. The next morning, he prepared everything he could. A donkey, a waterskin, a bag with dates and dry bread. No luxuries, no heavy saddlebags. Only the essentials. And faith. The road was long, winding through hills and valleys, over 120 kilometers to Bethlehem, on an uneven path, sometimes among olive trees, sometimes among cliffs. Mary mounted the animal with difficulty. Her belly now dominated her body, transforming her silhouette. Joseph arranged blankets under her, trying to soften the impact of the journey. He could not remove the stones from the path, but he could make the journey bearable. The first day was the most difficult. The silence between them was not empty, but reverent. The stones on the path seemed to have eyes. Every village they passed through brought curious, sometimes hostile, glances. The couple traveling unhurriedly, he attentive. She protected her womb with her hands, raised questions no one dared ask aloud. At night, They slept under a gnarled fig tree, with the donkey tied to a branch and their bodies covered with thin blankets. Joseph did not sleep. The wind was cold, and the sound of the forest kept him alert. More than that, the responsibility he felt was overwhelming. He was not just carrying a woman. He was carrying the promise of divinity in gestation. On the second day, the heat intensified. The trails became dusty and dry, and Joseph's feet burned inside his leather sandals. He avoided looking back, but heard Mary's labored breathing. They stopped frequently. He wet a cloth and placed it on her neck. They shared water in measured sips. When they found shade, they rested. When there was silence, they prayed, not with words, but with upward glances to the sky. On one of the steepest stretches, Mary slipped as she dismounted the donkey. Joseph caught her by reflex, with strength and fear mixed. The fall didn't happen, but the scare lingered. She gave a weak smile. He didn't respond. He simply embraced her, as if trying to hold the whole world in his arms. On the third day, the hills of Judea were already visible in the distance. Bethlehem emerged as both promise and exhaustion. Joseph's legs trembled. His eyes burned, but he did not complain. With every step, he felt the weight of the calling. The Creator who had spoken to him in a dream was now walking there, silently clothed in flesh, within Mary's womb. It was more than a journey. It was an inverted exodus. Not to flee a place, but to reach a promise. When they sighted the first houses of Bethlehem, the sky was already tinged with purple. The sun was setting behind the hills, and the bells of the flocks sounded in the distance. Joseph looked at Mary and saw her cry silently. It wasn't pain. It was relief. And it was just the beginning. The city of the ancient king was full. Bethlehem, once small and discreet, pulsed with the chaos of imperial registrations. Dozens of family strangers in caravans crowded the courtyards, vying for space in inns, on porches, even in makeshift stables. The streets teemed with hurried footsteps and loud voices. But none of those voices were there out of faith. They were there out of obligation. Joseph guided Mary carefully. The donkey moved slowly, shaking her already tense belly. Sweat trickled down his temples. His gaze, once vigilant, was now urgent. Time was running out, and Mary could no longer hide her contractions. The first door refused politely. The second, coldly. The third didn't even open. All occupied. "Come back tomorrow," they shouted from inside. Joseph didn't respond. He just nodded, retreated, tried the next. With each refusal, the burden increased. Not the luggage, but the weight of helplessness. The man called to protect the Son of Divinity could not even find a place of shelter. Night approached, and with it, the biting cold. Mary gasped. Her hands squeezed her belly tightly. Her eyes, once firm, now trembled between pain and hope. "Joseph," she murmured, "it's close." He knew, and yet he had found nothing. He went up another street, turned another alley, all in vain. No one wanted to make room. Not for them. Not for that heavily pregnant woman. Not for that excessively silent man. There was no honor in what they saw, only discomfort. Finally, an elderly woman pointed them to a rudimentary shelter south of the city. It wasn't a house. It wasn't an inn. It was a cave. Shepherds use it to protect their animals, she said, without waiting for thanks. Joseph thanked her anyway. He led Mary carefully, climbing the last slope under the bluish light of the moon. When they arrived, silence surrounded them. It was a stone cavity, smelling of old straw, damp walls, and air saturated with animal odor. But it was a shelter, and that, at that moment, was everything. Mary did not complain. She just nodded. Joseph hastened to clean the space. He gathered clean straw, cleared away dry dung, pushed the donkey into a corner. He fetched cloths, water, spread a blanket over a large stone. He prepared everything as he knew how, or rather, as best he could. The first cry came while he was still preparing. Joseph turned, shocked. Mary was already lying down, her face contorted, her fingers gripping the edge of the stone. She looked at him, and she didn't ask for help. She asked for his presence. He approached, knelt beside her, took her hand. And there, under a stone roof and a starry sky, in the womb of the earth, the birth happened. There was no midwife. There were no instruments. There was only a man with calloused hands and a woman in sacred pain. Life burst forth with blood and cries. First hers, then his. The child's cry filled the cave like an unseen trumpet. Joseph felt the air split in two. He had never heard such a sound, not of strength, but of rupture. There he was, the boy, the promised one, the Word made flesh, now wrapped in blood, skin, and fragility. So small, so human. Joseph picked him up carefully. His hands, accustomed to the roughness of wood, now trembled before the newborn. He washed him with warm water, dried him with his own clothes, and laid him on the straw. Mary smiled, exhausted. Her eyes overflowed. "He is born," she said softly. Joseph did not answer. He simply fell to his knees. In that instant, everything stopped. The world remained oblivious. Rome slept. The priests slept. The wise slept. But there, in a forgotten cave in Judea, eternity breathed for the first time. The righteous man who did not speak now wept, not tears of despair, but of reverence, because he knew the promise had been fulfilled, and he had seen it born. The visits of the unusual and the open heart. The cave still smelled of dry blood and damp wood. The newborn slept on the straw, wrapped in humble cloths. Mary rested nearby, exhausted but serene, her hand resting on her now empty womb. The donkey chewed straw in the corner, and the night wind entered gently, as if respecting that sacred space. Joseph remained standing. He looked at the boy with a reverence that mixed fear, admiration, and a tenderness he did not yet know how to name. His knees ached. His mind still couldn't process everything. But his spirit knew that this moment was not just a birth. It was a revelation. And then footsteps came. First, the soft sound of staffs dragging dust. Then, hushed voices, whispers of those who fear their dream might break. Joseph turned. At the cave entrance, silhouetted by the pale moonlight, a group of men appeared. Shepherds, simple, poorly dressed, with calloused hands like his own. But there was something in their eyes, an urgency that came from beyond the earth. Joseph, instinctively, placed himself between them and the child, not out of fear, but out of protective instinct that had just been born. A brief, tense silence filled the air. Then one of them spoke. His voice choked. "A messenger appeared to us in the field." There was daylight, and he said the Savior had been born today here in Bethlehem, and we would find him wrapped in swaddling clothes, lie in a manger. Joseph did not reply. He simply turned slowly, extended his arm, as if to say, "He is there." The men approached, tears in their eyes. They fell to their knees, touched their foreheads to the stone floor, whispered praises with choked voices. Joseph watched. He didn't know them, and they didn't know him, but they all knew. They were witnessing something none of their fathers, grandfathers, or teachers had ever seen. Suddenly, they were no longer shepherds. They were momentary prophets, priests of the invisible, men who had spent their lives among sheep and thorns, now before the Lamb. One of them, without melody, without rhythm, but only with ancient words, sang, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace to those on whom his favor rests." The echo of that phrase pierced Joseph's bones. Man of goodwill, that's what he was. Nothing more. No title, no glory. Only goodwill and obedience. The shepherd stayed until dawn. Then they departed as they came, discreetly, but now with their eyes ablaze. On the way back, they would tell everyone, not with eloquence, but with the strength of those who had seen. And whoever sees transforms. Hardly had they left when new footsteps approached. Joseph heard heavier steps. Men in long robes, camels, dark, penetrating eyes. They were not of Joseph's people. They were not of the people of the promise. And yet they were there. They were kings, or something like it. Wise men, some said, scholars of the stars, guided by a light that had torn to the heavens. They came from afar from the east. They carried precious objects, but their eyes said that nothing was worth more than what they saw there, a child on the straw. They bowed and offered gold, frankincense, and myrrh, symbols of royalty, worship, and, yes, of death. Joseph saw everything, but did not intervene, did not interrupt, did not comment. He simply stored it all in his heart. If he had doubted before, now he understood. Heaven was not just announcing. It was coming, and it brought with it the extremes of the world. Shepherds and kings, the field and the palace, the staff and the scepter. Everything converged on that doorless place. Because there, lying on the straw, was the center of everything. Mary watched, her eyes moist. Joseph remained by her side, his face illuminated by the faint morning light entering through the cracks. No one asked who he was. None of the visitors greeted him as the protagonist. And it was right, because his mission was not to be seen. It was to sustain what no one could see. When the last ones left, Joseph closed the cave entrance with a piece of cloth. He sat beside the manger, and there, for the first time since everything began, he allowed himself to rest. But even with heavy eyes, his soul remained awake, because while everyone saw the boy, he also saw the road, the dangers, the burden of raising him, the responsibility that did not end with the birth. It only began there. Joseph was the invisible guardian of the promise, and heaven knew it. Your participation is essential so that this narrative can reach even more people seeking meaning. Subscribe, leave a like, and share with someone who values stories that touch the soul. Your action helps us expand the reach of this message. Let's continue the story. Exile in the foreign heart. The night was heavy. The wind that had once passed softly through the cave now brought omens. Joseph did not sleep. His eyes, though exhausted, remained attentive to the silence. Mary's breathing was calm. The child, huddled in worn cloths, slept with the serenity of one who does not yet know that the world can be cruel. Then the dream came, but not like the others. The voice was the same, clear, firm, incisive. Get up, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I tell you, for the king is going to search for the child to kill him. Joseph woke up sweating, his heart pounding, his body tense. He sat up with wide eyes. The name of that cruel king burned in his ears. The monarch who had killed children, wives, brothers, the one who tolerated no threats, not even rumors. If there was a name that the righteous feared, it was his. And now, he was coming after a newborn. Joseph did not hesitate. He rose silently, knelt beside the child, and gently took him in his arms. He pressed his son's small head to his chest. Then he woke Mary with a whisper and a look that said, "That's it. It's time. We need to go." She didn't ask why. She knew the tone of urgency in Joseph's expression. She got up, adjusted the cloths on her body, wrapped the baby in blankets, and tied them securely. In a few minutes, they were ready. The donkey was pulled with gentle force. The tools, the few provisions, the extra clothes, everything was packed into tight sacks. There was no time for goodbyes, nor for explanations, only for steps. The streets of Bethlehem were deserted. The houses slept. But the sky seemed to watch. The moon, still high, illuminated the stones of the path. Joseph guided quickly and carefully. With every distant sound, he quickened his pace. His body trembled, not from cold, but from anticipation. The sword was coming, and he knew it. The road south was rough. Narrow paths between hills, unknown valleys, trails used by merchants, by soldiers, and now by fugitives. Egypt was over 400 kilometers away. But Joseph didn't think about distance. He thought about safety. With every turn, he felt time slip through his fingers like fine sand. Mary enveloped the child with her own body, whispered ancient prayers, asking that the Creator's eyes not blink. Joseph looked ahead, but heard the echoes of the dream behind him. The king would send soldiers. They would come with sharp blades, with shouts, with orders, and they would not seek explanations. They would seek the child, the newborn, the one who did not speak, who had barely learned to open his eyes. As he walked, Joseph felt anger rise, not just against the cruel king, but against the world. A world that did not accept innocence. A world where the Savior had to flee like a thief. But he controlled it, because his role was not to avenge. It was to protect. On the second day of their flight, their provisions were almost gone. Joseph divided the bread into tiny pieces. The water was drunk in silence, like a rare blessing. The donkey stumbled. Mary trembled, and the child cried only from hunger. Still, they continued. At night, they slept in the open. Joseph kept his eyes open while the other two slept. He listened to every sound, the rustle of trees, the distant lowing of herds, the silence before a howl. With every crackle, he gripped his staff tightly, ready to defend with his life what heaven had entrusted to him. They passed through discreet villages, avoided main routes, crossed shepherds' paths and areas used by exiles. Egypt was not holy land, but it was refuge. And at that moment, that was what mattered. Days later, the first outlines of the foreign land emerged. Palm trees, scorching sand, distant temples, soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms. The language was strange, the looks suspicious. But there was silence, and no one knew them there. It was in a village of Egyptian Jews that Joseph found shelter. A small room, mud walls, low ceiling. It was not a home, but it was life. When he laid the child on a bundle of straw, Joseph did not cry, but he felt the weight of what had been done. He had saved the promised one. But at what cost? Days later, the news arrived. In Bethlehem, mothers wept. The land had been stained. The cruel king's order had been carried out. The cry of the innocents echoed through the hills. And Joseph remained silent, because he had heard the call. He had answered, and the child slept. So you don't miss any detail. If you're still with us, feeling the power of this story, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share this video. Your interaction is a sign to us that we are on the right path, uncovering treasures. The hidden life in the years in Heliopolis. Egypt was not like Galilee. There were no gnarled olive trees, no green hills, no the familiar sound of ancient songs at dusk. Here there was sand, imposing temples, statues of strange gods, and a language that sounded like stones falling into still water. Joseph walked the streets with downcast eyes, controlled steps, alert senses. The child was in Mary's arms, wrapped in faded cloths, his eyes half open, a face still innocent. Here, no one recognized him. No whispers, no scandals, no judgments. Exile, though harsh, offered a truce. They settled on the outskirts of Heliopolis, in a modest village where Jews had lived scattered since time immemorial. It was a community forgotten by the powerful of the empire, but faithful to its ancient precepts. Simple people, but welcoming. People who knew what it meant to live far from their homeland, and yet keep hope alive. Ancient historians would say, centuries later, that the Jews of Egypt preserved their customs like one guarding a flame against the wind. And it was there, among them, that Joseph found a safe harbor, a mudroom, a crooked wooden door, a narrow window, a makeshift home. But it was enough. Joseph returned to his carpentry. The city needed boxes, carts, well frames, and his hands, though marked by the journey, still knew how to shape. Language was a barrier, but his craft spoke for him. He worked from dawn to dusk, and at night returned to watch the boy grow. He didn't say much, but he said everything with his eyes. Mary took care of the home. She baked flatbread, heated water, rocked the child to the sound of whispered prayers. Her hair was now more tied back, her shoulders heavier, but her gaze remained firm. She and Joseph shared everything: coins, silence, fear, faith. Little by little, Joseph learned the ways of the village, met the neighbors, gained people's trust. The children watched him with curiosity. They called him the man who doesn't talk much. The elders recognized him, son of the lineage of David, a reverence no one dared to explain. He missed Nazareth, the trees, the sounds, the familiarity of his old home, but he knew they were needed there. It wasn't exile. It was mission. The Creator had not abandoned them. He had simply moved them. One night, the child awoke with a fever. Joseph sprang from bed. He prepared an herbal infusion, moistened cloths, prayed in silence. Mary cradled the child, his forehead damp, his lips dry. The night stretched out like a bottomless well. But at dawn, the fever broke, and the child slept peacefully in the arms of his earthly father. It was at that moment that Joseph realized protecting was not just fleeing the sword. It was also watching amidst fever, caring in silence, loving in small details. The fatherhood the Creator had entrusted to him had no glory, but it carried an eternal weight. Months passed. Egypt remained strange, but was no longer hostile. Joseph walked with more confidence, bought supplies more easily, spoke few words, but with firmness. The workshop grew, his reputation solidified, and yet no one knew who the child was. No one suspected the truth, and that was for the best. Joseph knew his role was not to reveal. It was to protect. On the sacred day of rest, they gathered with other Jews. They read the ancient scriptures, sang psalms, shared memories. Joseph listened more than he spoke, but his eyes shone when the child, still so small, fixed his gaze on the sacred scrolls, as if he already recognized the word. He saw and kept that in his heart. One afternoon, while adjusting a cartwheel, he heard Mary call him with a tone he already knew, something between surprise and reverence. Upon entering, he saw the child standing, supported by a beam. One step, then another, the first walk, the first gesture of the son, who would one day walk to sacrifice. Joseph did not applaud, did not shout. He simply knelt. And there, before the most common of acts, he felt the weight of the eternal. In that exile, Joseph became a complete father, not with words, but with presence, not with miracles, but with fidelity, because to be the father of the Savior was, above all, to be the faithful shadow of the eternal Father, the way back and the shadow of what was to come. Time in Egypt had no seasons, not like in Nazareth. The sky there was always dry, the earth always hot, the faces always different. Joseph no longer counted days. He counted signs. And the sign came on a quiet night. He dreamed, and in the dream, the same voice from before returned. Get up, take the child and his mother, and return to the land of Israel. Those who were seeking the child's life are dead. Joseph opened his eyes slowly, but his heart was already in motion. Mary's tranquil breathing beside him, the child sleeping peacefully. Everything seemed to hang by a thread. He got up without making a sound, went to the entrance of the mud house, and looked east. In the distance, the hills of Judea called. It was time to return. The next day, they gathered their few possessions. The donkey was no longer the same. Old, tired, but still obedient. The tools, the cloths, the small coin box. Everything fit into 2 sacks. The child, now walking confidently, walked between Joseph and Mary, his eyes alert to the world. It was strange to think that they were returning to the land of promise, but not for the promise itself. They returned for survival. The mission continued silently. The sun, still hidden. The journey back was long, exhausting. The road home carried the weight of memories. The flight, the innocent blood spilled, the exile. Every step was a reminder. Joseph looked ahead, but saw the past. When they reached the border of Judea, the sun was already setting. A traveler approached and offered dry bread in exchange for water. They sat together and shared stories. The tyrannical king is dead, the man said, but his son, the new ruler, now commands in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. They say he inherited the cruelty, but not the cunning. Joseph listened in silence. He did not reply, but his heart tightened. Bethlehem? Not yet. That same night, the messenger returned. As before, as always, do not go back to Judea. Go to Galilee. Joseph awoke in peace. The direction was clear. Nazareth awaited them. The city that had seen them depart under judgment would now be a refuge. It felt strange. The plan seemed circular, returning to the place of contempt, humiliation, silence. But there was no mistake in it. There was purpose. The Creator once again used what was despised as a hiding place. Their entry into Nazareth was silent. No announcements, no trumpets. Just 3 travelers, dusty from the road, crossing the gate with downcast eyes and firm steps. Some faces were still familiar, and others pretended not to see. Joseph found shelter with distant relatives. A narrow room, stone walls, a straw roof. Not much different from what they had left. But now something was different about them. On the first morning, Joseph got up early, took his tools, and looked for work. Some hesitated. Others accepted out of compassion, but the wood did not question. It simply yielded to his firm hand, and soon the makeshift workshop breathed again. Mary reorganized the house. The cloths, the provisions, the water jars. The child grew. His eyes shone with questions. His hands already touched everything with lively curiosity. To every new sound, he wanted an answer. To every gesture, he imitated his father. Joseph watched him carefully, like one guarding a secret that cannot yet be revealed, like one who loves, knowing that one day he will have to let go. Nazareth slowly accepted them back, not with celebration, not with honor, but with that kind of tolerance that time teaches. Some still whispered, but now it was different. The boy was handsome, intelligent, obedient, and Joseph remained righteous. The return that never happened to Bethlehem became a permanence in Nazareth, and, with time, a mission, because Joseph understood it was not where he wanted to be, it was where he needed to be. The Creator's plan did not always follow human logic, and he had already learned to trust the voice of heaven more than the desires of his own heart. In the synagogue, he sat in the same corner quiet, but his eyes always turned to the boy. He taught him to measure, to cut, to sand, but also to listen, to pause, to respect. The work was hard, but there was peace in the labor, because every day lived with fidelity was another brick in the invisible temple being built there. No one spoke of Egypt anymore. No one asked about the birth. The city moved on, the world oblivious. But Joseph knew that there, hidden between stone walls and dust, the Savior grew, and he guarded him with his hands. The learning of silence and the forging of destiny. The sound of the hammer was the same every day. Wood against wood, stone against blade. Joseph's workshop had become part of the village's melody. Nothing showy, nothing grand, but constant. Like him, Nazareth no longer saw him as a stranger. He was simply the carpenter, the man who speaks little, works much, and always pays what he owes, the one who returns home at the same time, his tunic soaked with sweat and his face calm. But few knew that, in that space of dust and with shavings, something eternal was growing. The boy, Jesus, had begun to join his father. He had small hands, but curious, eyes fixed on every gesture. He didn't ask much, but absorbed everything. Joseph called in the morning with a nod, and the boy came, tying the belt of his tunic with fingers still clumsy, but determined. Bring the ruler, get the rope, hold firm. And he held firm. Sometimes he made mistakes. Sometimes he got hurt, but he never gave up. Joseph saw in him not just an apprentice, but a reflection of what he himself had been, a boy in silence seeking direction. Ancient teaching said, a father should teach his son to read, to swim, and to work. Joseph couldn't swim, but he taught with his hands, with wood, with sweat. He showed him how to respect each line of the board, how to listen to the sound of the chisel against the stone, how to measure twice before cutting once. It was more than technique. It was temperament. Jesus learned the weight of things, the wait before the harvest, the repetition of gestures that shape character. The two didn't talk much while working, but there was communication in every tool passed, in every shared silence, in every rhythm of breath between effort and relief. Mary, from the doorstep, watched them, father and son, one man hiding heaven in his hands, the other learning to use them. At noon they stopped. They sat under the fig tree next to the house, shared bread and water. Joseph ate slowly. Jesus did too. Sometimes the boy asked questions that went beyond wood. Father, why does the sun always rise on the same side every day? Joseph didn't answer with wise words, but said, because the Creator likes order. And the boy smiled, as if that were enough. Other times, Jesus observed the animals, the shape of the clouds, the way neighbors walked. Joseph perceived something more in his eyes, something that transcended childhood. But he didn't ask, not because he feared the answer, but because he knew that some answers grow on their own, like seeds. One afternoon, while teaching him to sand a piece of acacia, Joseph looked at the boy's hands. There were already small calluses, marks of effort, and for a moment, he remembered what the messenger had said years before. He will save his people from their sins. Joseph didn't know how or when, but he knew that every gesture, no matter how small, was part of something larger. Teaching Jesus to cut what was more than passing on a trade. It was preparing him to build, and perhaps to be broken. On the Sabbath, they walked together to the synagogue. Joseph held the boy's hand. They sat among the men, and the sacred book was read. The boy listened attentively, recited blessings with a voice still soft but firm. Then they returned in silence. The worn path, the sound of sandals, the gentle evening breeze. Joseph looked at him and thought, I teach him, but what does he know that I don't? Time passed with the slowness of one living with purpose. Days repeated themselves, but were never the same. Every board cut, every bench completed, every meal shared. Everything shaped what was to come. At night, Mary lit the lamp. Joseph made small adjustments to future projects. Jesus, already in bed, asked, You told me about the great King David, but he was a monarch. Why aren't you? Joseph smiled with a calm sigh. Because what matters isn't the throne, my son. It's faithfulness. And he turned, ending another day. Such were the years in Nazareth, invisible to the world, uncounted by historians, yet essential to heaven. Joseph, unknowingly, was teaching the Savior of the world how to be a man. And that was enough. The search for the impossible and the Father's broken heart. Jerusalem was bigger than Jesus remembered. Imposing walls, white stones burning under the sun, narrow streets teeming with pilgrims, merchants, and religious leaders. The city was a living organism, and Joseph observed it with cautious eyes. Mary walked nearby, watching her son's steps. It was a Passover festival, and they, like every year, went up to the holy city to celebrate. Jesus had just turned 12. He was no longer a child, but not yet a man. He walked between two worlds. There was something new about him, an attentiveness that heard more than it saw. In the temple courts, his eyes scanned every inscription with reverence. The offerings, the hymns, the debates among the teachers, everything touched him as if already familiar. Joseph watched from a distance. He didn't interfere, but he kept everything in his heart. The festival lasted the prescribed days. The city celebrated with fervor. When it ended, the crowd began to descend back to the villages. Joseph and Mary, trusting in the company of relatives and neighbors, walked with the group. The custom was for children to walk together in the caravan. But something seemed different about that return. At the end of the first day of travel, the group made camp. Night fell over the Judean hills. Mary went to look for Jesus among his cousins. She didn't find him. She asked friends. No one had seen him. She called Joseph with a tone of urgency he hadn't heard in years. He's not here. Immediately, Joseph stood up. His legs, stiff from the walk, began to move again. Quick, direct. One by one, he checked the travelers, the paths, the passing shepherds. Nothing. The boy had disappeared. The despair was silent. Joseph didn't shout, but the tension in his face, the rhythm of his breathing, the firmness with which he gathered his things, everything about him spoke of urgency. They returned to Jerusalem by the same road. 3 days. 3 days of searching. 3 days of anguish. 3 days of not knowing. Every morning, they entered synagogues, asked merchants, guards, women in the market. They described a boy with firm eyes, unusual words, a focused gaze. Some vaguely remembered. Others shook their heads. Nothing concrete. Joseph didn't sleep, barely ate. Fatigue weighed on his back, but he didn't stop. He walked without a map, only with the memory of his son's face and guilt squeezing his chest. On the 3rd day, they entered the temple, and there he was, sitting among the teachers, not standing like a student, but among them as an equal. He debated, asked questions, answered. The elders were amazed, not out of arrogance, but out of genuine awe. The wisdom that came from that still adolescent mouth was pure, clear, direct. And Joseph froze. For a moment, he didn't know whether to run to him or just watch. It was Mary who spoke first. Son, why have you treated us this way? Look, your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. Jesus turned. His eyes still seemed immersed in the sacred scrolls. But seeing them, a faint smile appeared, and he replied, Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house? Joseph heard, but did not understand. My Father. Those words pierced his heart with sweetness and pain. It was true. He had known it from the beginning, from the dream, from the cave. The boy was not his, or at least not only his. And yet Joseph was a father. Jesus' answer was not disobedience. It was revelation. He had not been lost. He had revealed himself. But Joseph still couldn't comprehend. His role was not to explain. It was to guard. Jesus got up, came to them, and walked with them back home. Along the way, little was said. The city faded behind them. Voices dissipated. Joseph looked at the boy walking ahead of him, and all that made sense was the next step. When they arrived in Nazareth, life continued. Jesus returned to the workshop, to the wood, to the routine. But something had changed. Joseph knew, and he didn't need to understand everything. It was enough to obey. The guardian's twilight and the legacy of silence. In Nazareth, time was not measured by years, but by harvest, by house repairs, by worn benches, worn tools, inherited cloaks. Joseph aged slowly, and Jesus grew at a pace that seemed measured by something the world could not grasp. The boy's voice deepened. His hands broadened. His eyes, once curious, became profound, as if seeing much further than what was before him. And yet he remained there in the workshop, helping, listening, carrying wood. Joseph saw everything, and at the same time did not understand. It was no longer about teaching. Now, it was about observing and accepting. Some days, Joseph saw him talking to passing pilgrims. Other times, he found him gazing at the sky for long moments, as if waiting for time to say something. At night, Jesus studied the ancient scriptures. He hungered for the word, as if it called him by name. Joseph remembered the temple, the answer he had heard years before. "Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" He never forgot those words. Joseph was never offended, but he also never fully understood them. Galilee was a rustic place. Rome's presence was constant. There were soldiers on the roads, heavy taxes, veiled threats. Faith, sometimes, was more burden than relief. There were scribes who monitored, merchants who bargained, and rebels who conspired. Joseph kept aloof from all this, but Jesus observed everything. Some days, Joseph noticed a sadness in Jesus that he couldn't name, a restlessness, a contained impulse, as if something within him was waiting for a call. It was then that Joseph felt the weight of his own limitations. He was a father, but there were limits even love could not cross. He could not protect him from what was within him. He could not mold him as he molded wood. He could not guide him where there was no path. Ancient historians, writing about the people of Galilee, spoke of hardened, hard-working men, faithful to tradition, but unable to see beyond what their eyes touched. Joseph was that man, righteous, firm, constant, but human, and his son was not just human. Joseph continued his craft. He made tables, doors, wheels. Clients respected him, called him reliable, silent, honest. Mary took care of the house. Jesus' sisters helped where they could. His younger brothers ran through the fields. But feeling of farewell slowly grew, like the breeze announcing a storm. One morning, while sharpening a blade, Joseph looked at Jesus and had the impression that he was already far away. Not physically, but in spirit, like someone who already walks a path no one else can see. He felt small, not from shame, but from reverence. It was like standing before a roofless temple and realizing that, despite working on the columns, he would never see the altar complete. That night, Joseph awoke with a strange feeling in his chest. It was not pain, nor a dream. It was like a voiceless whisper, saying, "Your time is ending." He said nothing to anyone. But that day, he worked more slowly. He called Jesus to cut wood with him. He touched his son's shoulder with more firmness. And when the day's work ended, he looked long at the sunset. He had done what he could. He had obeyed. He had protected. Now, the rest was between the Son and the Father, the Last Supper and eternal silence. It was a meal like any other. Stone-baked bread, fresh olive oil, figs lovingly cut, fresh water in a clay pitcher. The table was low. The wooden benches still creaked when someone sat down. Mary set the plates with her usual gestures. Jesus helped serve portions among his siblings. But Joseph felt something different that night. The smell of the food was the same, the words the same, but there was a silence that came from within, not from a room, but from time itself. A silence of farewell. He said nothing. He sat as always, rested his hands on his knees, observed. Mary talked with the younger ones. Jesus, now almost 30, ate slowly. His eyes were no longer those of a young man. They were those of a full-grown man. And Joseph knew that this man was the same boy he had held in his arms decades before in a cave in Bethlehem. And now it was time to let him go. There was no illness, no warning, just a premonition. A kind of emptiness that was not physical. It was spiritual, like a lamp that slowly dwindles without a flame. He felt no pain, but he felt the end. Ancient apocryphal accounts, which many had already dismissed as implausible, described Joseph's last days with simplicity. When the first historians mentioned them, they didn't treat them as legend, but as a living memory of a generation that still preserved details lost in the folds of time. And among these details, there was a meal, a last table, a common night marked by a hidden eternity. Joseph broke the bread, handed it to Jesus. There were no sacred words, but the gesture was laden with meaning. It was as if he was saying, "Now, you are the one who breaks. I have only served until now." Jesus looked at him calmly, as if he knew, as if he also felt that, after that supper, everything would change. They looked at each other for a long time. There were no tears, but there was surrender. Mary perceived it, intuited it. She said nothing, but sat beside Joseph, her plate still full. Her fingers touched his arm, an old gesture wife, a friend, a companion. After the meal, the younger ones dispersed. The lamp's flame flickered. The house breathed, as if trying to preserve the peace of the moment. Joseph did not get up. He remained there, seated, his eyes fixed on the fire. He felt light, as if he was no longer bound to the earth. Jesus sat beside him. "Is everything ready, Father?" he asked softly. Joseph nodded. Though he didn't understand everything, he felt everything. His time was complete. His work ended there. The planks, the tools, the teachings, everything was now in the Son's hands. He was not a priest nor a prophet, but his life had been an altar and a sacrifice. His silence was a word, his gaze a promise, his work obedience. "Take care of your mother," he murmured, his voice hoarse. Jesus took his hand. Strong, warm, always. Mary approached, wrapped Joseph in a thicker blanket. The night was cold, but he no longer felt it, no longer needed it. At that Last Supper, there was no miracle, but there was glory. The glory of a man who lived without fame, died without record, and yet faithfully sustained the Savior of the world, the Son. That morning seemed softer. The light entered the window more slowly. The house was silent, even with the sound of the village around. Inside, time had slowed down, as if waiting for something. Joseph was lying down, not from sudden weakness, nor from violent illness, simply because his body, after so many years of service, finally sought rest. His hands, once firm on tools, now rested on his chest. His face, marked by time, bore the serenity of one who never needed to be heard to be obeyed. Mary was beside him, seated, one hand in his, the other in her lap. Her moist eyes did not blink. And beside her, Jesus, now a man, stood but bowed in love. The two, the woman and the son, were all Joseph needed to see before he left. He said nothing. It was no longer necessary. From the earliest writings of the first masters of faith, there was a reverent consensus. Joseph died in peace, surrounded by Mary and Jesus. There is no official record, no specific verse in the commonly known texts. But the oldest tradition, maintained by authors like Jerome and Epiphanius, said that his departure was marked by a singular greatness, the silent presence of heaven by his side. Joseph knew the end was near, and he did not complain. He was not a man of laments. He was a man of acceptance. In his last days, he stopped going to the workshop. He sat outside in the afternoon sun, watching the fields, listening to birds. He called Jesus with his eyes, and together they shared small phrases, like remnants of a life that no longer needed explanations. "Do you remember when we made that table for Simon's family?" he once asked. Jesus smiled. "It's still sturdy." Joseph chuckled softly, like one who knows that everything done with love endures beyond time. Now, on that simple bed, surrounded by stone walls and memories, Joseph felt no fear, no regret. He felt fulfillment. Mary held his hand tightly. The silence between them was prayer. There were tears, yes, but not despair. They were waters that cleansed the soul before the flight. Jesus remained standing, looking into his eyes. No words were spoken, no sermon, only presence. Joseph's hand trembled slightly. His fingers reached for Mary's face. He touched her as if in gratitude. Then he looked at Jesus. And there, in that gaze, was everything a father wants to say to his son. "I trust you. I rejoice in you. Go." Jesus took that aged hand in both of his, held it gently, closed his eyes. Joseph's breathing lessened. First, a more spaced rhythm. Then lighter, until his chest stopped. And everything became silence. But not empty. It was a full silence. The same that had accompanied him from the beginning. The silence of the righteous, of those who obey without applause, of those who believe without signs, of those who love without needing to be remembered. Joseph left as he lived, without spectacle, without ceremony, only faith. Mary wept. Jesus remained silent. But there, in that hidden room in Nazareth, all of heaven bowed, because the man who once held the Savior of the world in his arms was now being held by him in eternity. The house without him, but with him, the house was the same. The wooden table was still firm in the center. The worn bench leaned against the wall. The utensils in their usual places. The smell of burning wood still clung to the cloaks. But Joseph was no longer there. Mary got up early, lit the flame, prepared the bread. She heard the silence. Not the silence of dawn, but the silence of absence. A silence that didn't weigh on the air, but on her chest. He wouldn't return. And yet, he seemed to be in everything. Jesus was now a man. At 30, his steps no longer asked permission to cross thresholds. But Mary saw in the way he arranged the workshop tools, in the way he gathered the wood shavings, the traits of his earthly father. Joseph remained alive in the son's gestures. Ancient writings would say, being, as was thought, the son of Joseph. As was thought. As if Mary read those words without reading them. She knew. Joseph knew. The Creator knew. But the world needed labels. And so Joseph, even absent, remained the name, in the memory, in the lineage. It was strange to see him disappear like that. Not just from life, but from records. No mention in sermons. No follower would call him. No miracle would bear his name. But those who had known his home knew. Joseph was the first altar where Jesus learned the silence of obedience. The workshop tools were still in their places. Jesus cleaned them from time to time, touched each one as if still hearing silent advice. The weight of the hammer, the alignment of the ruler, the smell of cut wood. Everything was memory. Joseph had passed in silence, and now the world would continue without him. But Mary did not. Sometimes she found his cloak folded in the corner. She touched it, held it, at night. She still lay on one side of the bed, as if her body expected the other space not to be empty. She didn't always cry, but she kept it, and keeping it hurt more. Jesus, for his part, began to go out more. Galilee called him the fields, the men, the unseen. It was as if a force pulled him outward, and Mary knew it was time. Still, the house was his starting point, and Joseph his reference point. When a neighbor greeted him, he would say, "There goes Joseph's son." Jesus smiled. He didn't correct them. He didn't need to. Truth doesn't require defense, only testimony. And Joseph had been exactly that. A silent testimony of what it means to trust the invisible. On cold nights, Mary sometimes lit the fire and waited. Jesus sat beside her. They shared dates or fig pieces. He spoke little, she even less, but there was peace in the unspoken. He would be proud. Jesus once said. Mary nodded, her eyes moist. She didn't need to ask who he was talking about. The name that was no longer pronounced was the name that lived most in that place. Joseph, the righteous, the hidden, the man who said yes to the impossible and never asked for a stage, who abdicated his own understanding to embrace the inexplicable, and who, because of that, was great. Time passed. The marks of pain became part of the soul's architecture. Mary cleaned the house, but did not erase the traces. Every crack in the wall told a story. Every piece of furniture still bore his hand. Jesus knew he would soon leave for good. The Jordan River was just ahead. The desert awaited him. But before leaving, he got up once more before dawn. He went to the workshop, lit a lamp, sat on the bench where Joseph used to sit, and there he stayed in silence as he used to do. The carpenter's mark and the invisible pillar. Jesus now walked among crowds. He healed with his hands, taught with authority, and dispelled fear with words that ignited the spirit. The blind could see, the deaf could hear, the dead rose, and people wondered, where does so much wisdom come from? How does he possess such power? Some said, he is a prophet. Others, he is the promised one. But there was always a voice that rose, laden with doubt and a certain scorn. Isn't this the carpenter's son? The carpenter's son. Joseph's name appeared like this, like a comma forgotten in a sentence about someone greater. There was no honor, no remembrance. None of the disciples mentioned him in their discourses. No religious leader accused him of anything. No parable included him. Joseph had disappeared. Ancient historians would write that the righteous men of Galilee were, for the most part, anonymous, invisible workers, silent citizens, people who built but did not sign, who obeyed but did not preach. And Joseph was exactly that, the foundation no one saw. But every temple needs a foundation, and the sun, now proclaimed from the mountains, was first sustained by a man who knew how to be a shadow, who said yes to the unknown, who abdicated his own understanding to embrace the inexplicable. While Jesus walked through Capernaum, while he multiplied loaves, while he was followed by fishermen and sinners, Joseph's name remained buried in the dust of Nazareth, without plaques, without altars, without songs in the synagogues. But Mary remembered. She remained silent when she heard people say, "Son of Joseph." She did not correct them. She didn't need to, because she knew that, even absent, he was still there, in the way Jesus listened before speaking, in the firmness with which his hands held the sick, in the care with which he built the kingdom with words. Joseph had no pulpit, but he was the first to prepare the ground for the word. In a time when names multiplied, the tyrannical king, the religious leader, the oppressive governor, the general, Joseph's name became increasingly rare. Glory did not pass him by. History did not crown him, but heaven knows him. Jesus never forgot him. When teaching about seeds that die to bear fruit, he spoke with the calm of one who had seen hands bury promises without applause. When speaking of faithful servants, his eyes always carried the memory of a man who preferred to obey rather than be seen. The righteous, like Joseph, do not appear in the books of kings, nor at the banquets of empires. They die before fame. They leave before the spectacle. But their traces remain in the structures. Their gestures shape the foundations. Joseph's absence from the records was not a mistake. It was a message. The Creator wanted him to remain hidden to show that the invisible sustains the visible, that the Son's glory rests on the fidelity of the earthly Father, that the kingdom begins in silence, in workshops, in nights of flight. When preaching in the synagogues, Jesus mentioned the great leaders of the past, but his heart remembered the carpenter. Joseph didn't need to be remembered to have value. His mark was on the Messiah, and that was enough. The silent inheritance and the echo of a name. Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? The question, spoken with disdain, cut through the murmuring crowd like a spear disguised as irony. It wasn't just a doubt. It was a reminder of origin, a reminder that the man who taught with such authority was, after all, from Nazareth, from that common house, that dwelling of wood and mud, where everyone knew everyone. And aren't his brothers among us? James, Joseph, Simon, Judas, common names, children of the same house, raised under the same roof, amidst the smell of cut wood and the steam of bread from the oven. Some of them believed. Others did not. And the people knew this. The people used this. Joseph raised them all. It didn't matter if they were by blood or by alliance. The wood that shaped tables also shaped bonds. And Joseph was a master at it. He didn't teach with speeches, but with repetition, with routine, with faithfulness. Each of those children learned to cut with precision, to measure with care, to carry weight without complaining. Joseph made sure to teach that work was not just obligation. It was virtue. And even when Jesus' name echoed beyond the borders, when crowds followed him, his brothers still carried the smell of the workshop. There was a contrast within the house itself. James was serious, observant. He had unspoken questions that he kept to himself. Joseph noticed. Simon was impulsive, wanted to prove his strength, tested limits. Joseph called him with a look, and that was enough. Judas was sensitive. Joseph taught him with more time, more patience. Joseph, the son who bore his name, was the quietest. And then there was Jesus, the most different of all. As they grew up, comparisons were inevitable. Jesus is the most obedient, some would say. He is the strangest, others would say. But Joseph never treated any of them differently. The standard was the same, the tone the same. The hand that corrected also comforted. The wood from which they came was from a single tree. Faith. When the brothers heard about Jesus' signs, they reacted in different ways. Some doubted. Who does he think he is? Others remained silent. He's always been like this. Some avoided him. Others grew angry. None of them knew what to do with the greatness that grew amidst common blood. But Joseph would have loved them just the same. Time had already taken him, but his teachings were ingrained in the habits of the house. He was the one who distributed the first pieces of bread, who divided tasks, who taught that work begins before the sun rises and ends only when it is well done. The brothers' doubt was not heresy. It was human. They had seen Jesus stumble in the yard. They had seen him scrape his knee, miss a cut, cry for a sick animal. How could they now accept that he was the promised one? But what they didn't understand was that his humanity did not deny his divinity. It was part of the plan. Joseph knew this. Even without understanding everything, he knew his role was not to prove anything, only to mold. And he did so with silence, with firmness, with hands that held and let go at the right time. James later would understand. He would become a leader among the Messiah's followers. But for now, he still wavered. Jesus, faced with the disbelief of his own, was not offended. He merely recognized that even those raised under the same roof may not see what is before their eyes. And yet he loved them all, because he learned from Joseph. Before the next turn of this narrative is revealed, if this journey is resonating with you, please subscribe to the channel, leave your like on the video, and send it to someone who needs to hear this story. Your support expands the reach of this message. And now, back to the narrative. The Father's echoes in the essence of a gesture. Crowds followed Jesus everywhere. They wanted healing, answers, confrontation. Religious leaders wanted proofs. The sick wanted a touch. The poor wanted bread. And he gave, but with compassion, with authority, with mystery. But there was something few noticed. In every gesture he made, there was an ancient echo, the echo of a father. The son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees his father doing. The words echoed to the temple courtyard, piercing walls and hearts. The listeners thought of the Creator, the Lord of hosts, the Heavenly Father. But perhaps unknowingly, they were also hearing the reflection of a man who had shaped the boy from Nazareth, the earthly father. Joseph, absent from public ministry, forgotten in narratives, erased from miracles, but present in every gesture Jesus made. The way he listened before speaking, the way he paused before acting, the firmness in his gaze, the reverence for work well done. Everything came from an earlier place, from the workshop, from home, from silence. When Jesus healed, he did not rush to touch. When he spoke, he did not shout. When he walked through the villages, his steps were calm, attentive to the ground. There was no haste in his ministry, because the time Joseph had taught him was not the time of men. It was a time of growth, of care, of urgent surrender. Joseph never said, Follow me." But the son followed him for 30 years. Jesus remembered the damp wood, the smell of olive oil on his father's fingers, the way he steadied the plank with one hand and planed it with the other. He remembered the insistence on teaching that a wrong cut is not fixed with haste, but with patience, that a structure can only stand if the foundation is deep. All this he learned from his earthly father to then give himself to the heavenly Father. When Jesus spoke of seeds that die to bear fruit, he remembered how Joseph carefully planted seedlings. When he spoke of vines and branches, he remembered the vineyards on the hillside they had pruned together. When he spoke of the easy yoke, he remembered the yokes his father made, not to burden the ox, but to lighten its load. Joseph did not teach theology, but he taught presence. He did not explain mysteries, but respected them. He did not perform miracles, but sustained the greatest of them with his own name. When Jesus prayed, often in silence, he was like Joseph, who always chose silence before response. When he withdrew to be alone, he was like the father who preferred to listen rather than be heard. And when he forgave, he was like Joseph had forgiven him as a child, without condemnation, just with a gesture of acceptance. Joseph's absence was now complete. His hands were gone. His shadow no longer appeared at the door. But the son carried within himself the carpenter's mark, the invisible mold of the righteous man. And that was enough, because even the Savior who became flesh needed human hands to be molded. Joseph, a simple name, a common name, a name repeated in many homes among many children, but also a chosen name, because every name, say the wise, carries a hidden destiny within it, waiting for someone willing to carry it. And he accepted it. Joseph, of the lineage of David, born without glory, lived without fame, and died without a written history. But that is precisely why heaven chose him, not so that his name would shine in the records of kings, but so that it would shine where no one sees, in the backstage of the miracle. From the beginning, the name Joseph carried echoes of another patriarch, the son of ancient Jacob, the one who was sold, humiliated, forgotten, and later exalted in foreign lands, the one who sustained his family even after betrayal. And like the first Joseph, Mary's husband was also a man of dreams, of silence, of faithfulness. He had no throne, but he held the throne in his arms, in the form of a child. He wore no crown, but he protected the one who would be crowned with thorns. In the tradition of the ancients, giving a name was sealing a path. And when Mary gave birth and Joseph named him as the messenger had ordered, Jesus, he sealed more than a civil record. He sealed his own surrender, because by naming, he was claiming. By saying Jesus, he was saying mine. And the name Joseph, once forgotten among stones and tools, became the foundation of the word. His legacy was not left in parchments. He did not found schools. He left no speeches. But he left footprints on the land of Nazareth. He left marks in Jesus' eyes. And because of this, even if the world forgets him, his name remains in the heavens. Through generations, many sons would bear this name, not for glory, but from a desire to learn from the righteous one who obeyed in silence. Joseph didn't need to understand all the mysteries. He only needed to trust. He didn't demand signs. He simply listened and responded. His name did not change the world by force, but shaped the one who would change everything. When people asked, "Isn't this Jesus, the son of Joseph?" it was more than a question. It was a seal, a reminder that the Messiah had a father, that the Creator, in coming to the world, entrusted himself to the hands of an ordinary man. And that man did not fail. The name Joseph carried wood and dust, but also promises. He did not know how great he was, and he didn't need to. Joseph's greatness was precisely in never seeking to be great, and because of that his name echoes, not in palaces, but in humble homes, not on thrones, but in hearts that prefer obedience to understanding, that prefer to protect rather than dominate, that prefer silence to proof. The blade of the question in heaven's answer. Isn't this the carpenter's son? The phrase was spoken with disdain, with incredulity, with that kind of scorn that hides fear. Isn't this the carpenter's son? As if carpenters couldn't create great works, as if hands at work couldn't shape the invisible. But heaven doesn't think like men. In human eyes, Joseph was just a man among planks, a craftsman among many. His hands bore calluses, not titles. His sun-bronzed face was not seen in the circles of the wise. His name too common, his trade too simple. But for heaven, Joseph was more than a carpenter. He was a chosen guardian, the craftsman who would mold not just furniture, but the Messiah himself. The workshop in Nazareth was small. It smelled of raw wood, olive oil, and dust. Hammer, chisel, sandpaper. The tools were few but sufficient. Joseph taught Jesus to work and, unknowingly, prepared him for something greater. Every time he aligned a doorframe, he taught firmness. Every time he repaired a crack, he taught restoration. Every time he paused to think before cutting, he taught discernment. He didn't preach sermons, but his tools did. The world saw wood, but heaven saw a structure. The world saw a hammer, but heaven heard a prayer. Joseph didn't know what was coming. He didn't know about sacrifices. He didn't know about tombs. But his craft was enveloped in prophecy. He taught the Son of God to work with nails, without knowing that those same nails would one day pierce his hands. The irony was sacred, not to humiliate, but to show that the Creator transforms the ordinary into the eternal, that the floor of Joseph's workshop was also temple ground, that every bench he built carried an invisible prophecy. The Messiah would sit on something made by his human hands, taught by Joseph's hands. The carpenter's trade was not a shame. It was a disguised honor. Joseph was not just a worker. He was a transmitter. What he received from his parents, he passed on. What he learned in silence, he taught with a glance. His workshop was a school, an altar, a refuge. It was where the word became gesture. He wrote no books, but his hands left marks on Jesus. When Jesus healed with a touch, that touch already knew the weight of wood. When he sat at the table with the outcast, that body already knew the balance of a well-made board. When he spoke of the light burden and the easy yoke, he spoke of experience. Experience learned there among sawdust and nails. Joseph was called a carpenter, but heaven called him my faithful servant. He didn't need miracles to be used by the Creator. He only needed to obey, to work, to love, to care, to sustain, to wait, to persevere. In every hammer blow, a silent prayer. In every plank, an invisible promise. In every nail, a surrender. The world forgot him, but the Son did not. Jesus carried Joseph's marks until the end. Not the marks of genetics, but of common life. The firmness, the sweetness, the silent righteousness. All that was Joseph, the carpenter of divinity. And when in sacrifice they mockingly called him king, perhaps in a fleeting memory, Jesus thought of the one who once taught him to hold a hammer, and who never sought honor, only presence. The hill of pain and the Father's shadow. The path to the hill of pain was paved with stones and blood. Crowds followed. Some wept, others shouted. Many just watched, confused. Soldiers hurried him. The cross weighed on the Son's back, and though his steps faltered, they continued. But there was something that did not falter, the gaze. Jesus did not look at the ground, nor at his aggressors. His face was disfigured, his shoulders torn, but his eyes were firm, as if seeking something beyond the pain, as if carrying not just a burden, but also a memory. And those who had known him well knew that gaze was Joseph's. They were no longer together. Death had already separated the righteous man from the Son, now dying for the unrighteous. But even absent, Joseph was there, not in body, but in memory, in the lessons, in the gestures the Son held within himself. When Jesus fell, the hands that tried to help him were not Joseph's, but the memory of his Father helped him to stand up. From childhood, every fall was followed by a silence, a strong arm, and a calm voice. "Get up, my son. You can do it." In the sacrifice, that voice was no longer present, but the echoes remained. The Messiah climbed the hill carrying the world, and also the teachings of home. Joseph never witnessed miracles. He never saw the crowds. He never heard the sermons. But he saw the boy learn to walk, to carry tools, to forgive neighbors, to share food, to get up early to help. And perhaps he saw something more, a light in the Son's eyes that he never understood, but always respected. Now, that light endured even the shadow of death. The cross was planted. Nails pierced the flesh. Voices scoffed. The sky darkened. But Jesus' eyes did not close. They looked at Mary. They looked at his friend. They looked at the repentant criminal. And finally, they looked up. But at some point, perhaps inwardly, Jesus also looked back to the house, to childhood, to the man who raised him asking nothing in return. Joseph never had all the answers, but he was present. He never asked for glory, but he gave a name. He never understood everything, but he never stopped caring. And now, on that cross, the Son did the same. He gave himself without asking for anything. He fulfilled his mission without seeking defense. He died as he lived, with obedience. Joseph was not on the hill of pain. His voice was not heard. His name was not recorded. But in the Son, he was fully there. Because in every gesture of Jesus, there were traces of the carpenter. When he forgave his accusers, he was like Joseph, who forgave in silence. When he took care of Mary, he was like Joseph, who had protected her from the beginning. When he surrendered his spirit, he was like Joseph, who always gave everything without fanfare. The cross was new, but the wood was old. Old like the workshop, like the home, like a father's love. The sky darkened, the earth trembled, the veil was torn, and Jesus' eyes closed. But even closed, they continued to say, "He taught me to walk." Joseph left long before the harvest of pain, but the hill of pain was never without him, because the Son's eyes, until the end, reflected the righteous man who taught him to see, the silence that cries out and the forgotten heritage. The silence of the righteous cries out louder than prophets. Joseph said nothing. There is no record of a phrase, a speech, a parable, not even a greeting. He passed through the account of Jesus' life like one who walks without leaving footprints. But his lack of words was, in itself, a language. Joseph's silence was not omission. It was choice. It was surrender. It was reverence before the mystery entrusted to him. While others clamored for signs, Joseph heard dreams. While others made vows, Joseph obeyed in silence. While others demanded answers, Joseph simply walked. He did not need to justify himself when Mary appeared pregnant. He did not argue with the celestial messenger. He did not protest against the census. He did not question the flight to Egypt. He acted, and in acting he taught. The first teachers would say, centuries later, that the silence of the righteous speaks louder than prophets. And there was no man more righteous and more silent than Joseph. His theology was not on parchments. It was in daily life, in the way he looked at Mary, in the way he protected the Son, in the way he sustained the home. His hands preached, his eyes interceded, his breathing prayed, and his silence echoed. In the tradition of the wise, it is said that men of wisdom speak little, and the truly righteous speak even less. Because silence, when sacred, is not empty. It is a fullness that cannot be contained in words. Joseph lived this way. When the messenger visited him in a dream, he told no one. When he left with Mary for Bethlehem, he did not complain. When he found no room at the inn, he improvised. When he fled to Egypt, he carried the promise in his arms and no complaint on his lips. There was no time for speeches, only for faithfulness. It is curious. So many men left words. The great leader left laws. The poet king left songs. The prophet left visions. The fisherman left letters. The wise apostle left treatises. But Joseph, nothing. And yet, he is among the greatest. Because while others spoke about the Creator, Joseph held the Creator in his arms. He fed him, protected him, taught him to walk, to hammer, to listen. And he did it in silence. Perhaps that is precisely why his figure disturbed so many. Because we live in a world that screams, that explains itself, that self-promotes. And Joseph simply was. He was righteous. He was a father. He was a servant. Nothing more. And therefore everything. His lack of words is not weakness. It is strength. Because true love needs no justifications. True faith demands no applause. True obedience makes no noise. Joseph lived hidden. He died without ceremony. He was buried without honors. But in heaven his name is known. not because he spoke, but because he lived. Today, many seek to leave memorable phrases, sayings, texts, publications. But Joseph's legacy is different. It is the hidden life that sustained the visible. He is a man whom no one heard, but whom everyone feels. The son did not quote him in the accounts, but carried him in his heart. And perhaps that is what matters most. Joseph did not need to say anything, because his silence still speaks. The final lineage in eternity, in absence. The story ends as it began, in silence. There are no statues, no inscriptions, no direct citations in the apostles' discourses, no glorious appearances. Joseph disappears from the narrative as discreetly as he entered, like a shadow that protects without being seen. But what is invisible to the eyes of men remains etched in heaven. The initial record begins with a lineage, ancient names, kings and shepherds, imperfect men and prophets, from Abraham to the great leaders, from the great leaders to the exile, from the exile to Joseph, not to Mary, not to Jesus, but to Joseph, the last human name in the family tree, the last link in a chain that stretched for centuries, wars, deserts, betrayals, and promises. Joseph did not biologically father the Messiah, but he received him, adopted him, gave him a name, a home, an inheritance, and that was enough, because the Creator does not measure blood. He measures the heart, in the tradition of his people. The Father is the one who transmits the name, and the name carries the destiny. Joseph, by naming Jesus, sealed prophecies, grafted the Son of Divinity into the royal lineage, fulfilled the ancient scriptures with the resolve of a man who, even without understanding everything, trusted the invisible. And so it ends, invisible yet eternal. The world remembers others for their keys, for their letters, for their laws, for their songs. But Joseph for his absence, absence of self, absence of vanity, absence of ambition, full presence in the depths of history. When Jesus spoke of the Father, he spoke of the eternal Father. But when he loved with tenderness, he carried the gesture learned at home. When he walked among carpenters, he knew the rhythm of work. When he remained silent before his accusers, there was in him the echo of the man who taught him the value of silence. Joseph's memory lives where few look, in Jesus' eyes, in Mary's resolve, in the structure of the home, in the warmth of a workshop, in the forgotten lineage. The wise writer did not err in ending with Joseph. It was there that everything came together, because at the end of the lineage, heaven approaches earth. In the simplicity of the righteous, the kingdom finds rest. In the surrender of the common man, eternity finds support. Joseph did not build temples, but he sustained the Savior of the world. He did not write laws, but he lived justice. He did not ascend to a throne, but he raised his home as an altar. In the stories of the great, he would be a footnote, but in heaven, he is a cornerstone. The lineage ends with him, but the legacy continues. In every righteous person who loves without recognition, in every father who cares without applause, in every believer who obeys without explanations, Joseph lives in silence, as always. But now the world sees him, because what is invisible in the eyes of the Creator is unforgettable. The next stories are already waiting for you on screen. Click now and continue unraveling the mysteries and forgotten treasures of the ancient accounts. Each chapter holds a truth that time tried to erase. Thank you for walking with us this far. May this journey remain alive within you. We will meet again in the next revelation. See you soon.